Welcome to the second lecture on the flux aesthetics, the unifying surface, and the drip. In the first lecture, we focused primarily on form with the classical aesthetics. There were some aspects of surface addressed, but mostly the emphasis was on the continuity of certain forms through time. And in this lecture, we will focus on the contribution of glazes, mostly at the level of surface in ceramics, with a focus on the drip. This first image is from the Ziwiye culture of Mesopotamia, and it shows an example of some of the very earliest glazes used in ceramics from the 3rd millennium BCE. So those objects are near 5,000 years old. They feel very fresh, very current, very contemporary. They haven't changed at all, basically, because of the amazing permanency of ceramics. And they're very beautiful things, and very early on you can see the sophistication of glazes used in ceramics. Now, the history of glazes in ceramics is rather complex. There are discoveries here and there, and it gets lost and forgotten, and it's reinvented again somewhere else. But it begins in Mesopotamia, and then it begins more or less at the same time in Egypt as well. And you have an example of an Egyptian bowl on the left, and then an example following the very same aesthetics of dark images, black images over a beautiful turquoise ground by Victor Schreckengoes from the 1930s. And yet a more recent example, quite recent, by Roberto Lugo. And it's interesting to consider that in ceramics, some aesthetics that may be millennia old, sometimes 2, 3, 4, 5,000 years old, are still used today and are still very potent. And it's interesting because it makes a connections to tradition, to history, to the passage of time, to the universal nature of human experiences. Some of my favorite glazes are Chinese, obviously. China made tremendous contributions to ceramics in all kinds of ways, and more significantly through the development of glazes. And I really like those Han Dynasty ill jars, where the lid was fired upside down over the jar so that the glaze ran in the kiln and collected as drips at the top of the mountain, adding to their elevation and an impression of lift that is implied in the work. I find those work very beautiful. You have an example here of that use of the drip in the work of Nancy Salvin, where this little bowl was fired upside down so that the glaze would collect at the rim as drips, as if the liquid contained inside the object, which is otherwise empty, had wanted to exit the objects and come out and flow out of the form and leave a remnant at the edge of the object. So people use glazes and the drip in all kinds of various ways. You have an example here on the left, again, of the reverse drip, where the object fired upside down contests gravity and our expectation of the behavior of liquids and fluids as they transform. And another example here by Galen Nang, where the excessive use of application and thickness creates this oozing effect of great efficiency. So I'm showing you some example again of Tang Dynasty Sankahai glazes, which are among some of my favorite because again their fluidity, their drippiness, the way they move over the form, the way they are applied. And Sankahai glazes are called three-color glazes because they usually are green, brown, yellow, sometimes on a white ground, very rarely with blue, but within a palette of very few colors like this, applied very strategically on those earthenware forms. Beautiful effects are achieved, and this has been tremendously influential, as we can see in the work of Mineo Mizuno on the right. So Sankahai influence I will go a bit more deeply in because since the Tang Dynasty, those three-colored glazes have been used in a broad variety of ways by many makers. And I really like those very extreme objects by Leopold L. Fulham and Richard Millet because they use the reference of the three colors to make work that analyzes the conceptual nature of form and volume and its connection with surface, relationship to history, with Richard Millet using the Kilix crater form as a flat surface on which he applies those colors. So he mixes different times, different geography, different cultures, different aesthetics, in order to challenge you to reassess your relationship to those type of objects and to ceramics as a whole. So there are many, many examples. I will just show you a few of people using those three colored glazes with very beautiful results. And you will notice that I have given those types of applications and effects names, like the run previously in the case of Walter Keeler, and here the splash in the case of Betty Woodman. And it's interesting to give names and start somewhat of a distinction between the various ways of applying glazes and what it induces in terms of a response from us through that specific way of putting glazes on. And what I like about the runniness of glazes is that it's a very specific ceramic aesthetics, not found to that degree in any other art form. And by using glazes with their translucency, their transparency, the way they are at some point a liquid that becomes a solid when you apply it, that then becomes a liquid again in the kiln and moves in the kiln and then resolidifies as it cools. All of those changes and transformations are very potent to signify human experiences and aesthetic beauty. One of the potters who have used three-colored glazes with the most efficiency and the greatest variety of approaches is Takeshi Yasuda, and he makes the form strategically with ridged places that collects and stops and control the movement of the glaze. And you can see how he has created very specific form of great originality and applied the glaze very strategically. Those very same three colors, green, brown, yellow, that we've seen since Tang Dynasty times, but used to create statements of great originality and personality. And this has been true throughout history. An example from Japan on the left from the 12th century, a more recent example from about 130 years ago now by George Orr on the right. And even people working in porcelain at high temperature with a very different type of glaze than the Tang originals and their followers. You have here Tom Turner and Linda Sikora using what I call the dispersion, where a glaze, when it melts in the kiln, moves and displaces other glazes and pushes them around in a way. And this is an effect one finds in three-colored glazes. And those makers, using very different material, very different ways of firing glazes, achieve quite similar results of great efficiency. So those glazes behave in all kinds of ways. I call what Andrew Martin does the smudge, because although patterns may have been applied quite geometrically and quite tightly, when the glaze moves and melts and displaces itself in the kiln when it's in a liquid state, it smudges the pattern and creates this beautiful effect. And many artists from all over the world use this great potential of the fluidity of glaze to create extraordinary, rich and beautiful and again ceramically specific surfaces on their wares. And I'm just introducing some makers here to you so that you may be curious to research them further and know more about who they are and what they've done. And I will complete this brief introduction to those glazes with this bowl from Oaxaca, Mexico. They've been made for a few hundred years there. They're glazed very spontaneously. They're stacked one on top on the other. They melt together and fuse together in the kiln. They have to be broken up from the mass to unload, and they have chips all over their lips. They're very cheap. They're very ordinary. They've been made by the millions over centuries. But I really like the way, an object's placed on its side or upside down moves the glaze in unsuspected directions and create effects and experiences that, again, work with gravity in very original ways. So there are all kinds of glazes, and I will introduce to some of them. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, China is a very important country when it comes to the development of new glazes. And you have two examples of that here: blackware glazes on the left, Chun glazes on the right. Again, this is just a brief introduction in case you're more curious to know about Celadon from Yaozu ware or Chun glazes from the Song Dynasty, or the kind of ware that was made in imperial times, or again this wonderful Mai Ping form from Yaozu ware from China. And you can see here from this Dingware from China as well that sometimes glazes can be very simple, very subtle. They don't really have to be, have multiple colors. They can be monochrome. They can be just white. And this is what has influenced Edmond de Waal on his work we see on the right. Copper red are a specifically Chinese invention, and those are two examples from two different periods of Chinese history. They're still very currently made all the way to today and have been very influential in the development of ceramic aesthetics all over the world, as do crackle glaze, which is also a specific Chinese invention. And you have, again, two wonderful examples here from two different periods of Chinese history. And this car with the paint job with the crackled Celadon effect is an interesting way to consider how specifically ceramic surfaces can inform other practices like painting the surface of a car, and again making this connection to history, to geography, to a specific time, to a specific aesthetic within a completely new context, while artists like Giselle X use crackle glaze to make work of great contemporaneity that could only have been in the very recent past. Another wonderful example by Takeshi Yasuda here in porcelain with the Celadon glaze. And what I liked in this object is the conflation of the fluidity of the clay, which was manipulated as if it was a liquid itself, and the liquidity and the fluidity of the glaze, and the two coming together in a way that makes you feel as if you could modify and still change the shape and form of that object while it has been obviously frozen in the process of firing it. Another great master of Celadon is Jean-François Fouillou from France. So again, some of you may be curious to know more about him and research him further. And an interesting character is Edmund Elton, working in England at the beginning of the 20th century. He was an amateur potter, quite wealthy, and he started a little workshop in his garden, and he developed wonderful glaze surfaces of great originality that references historical precedent, but create effects that had never existed up to that point in the ceramic vocabulary of glazes. Around that time as well, at the end of the 19th century, we have the development of luster glazes, a wonderful example on the left by Clément Massier from that time. This is the Art Nouveau period in art. And then throughout the end of the 20th century, Beatrice Wood made wonderful work with luster glazes as well. And luster glazes are interesting because they're some of the most extreme approach to extraordinary surface effects in ceramics. And Jolnay is one of the main manufacturers of luster glazeware starting in 1900 all the way to today. And Beatrice Wood, again, another example on the right. And designer Eva Zeisel, toward the end of her life, went to work at Jolnay in Hungary, and she made those wonderful vases with 5 different luster glazes, where you can see how the richness of the glaze and its extreme quality works wonderfully well on a form of such simplicity and implied elegance. So now we have a section on more drips, because I really want to focus on the drip, because I find it a very interesting aspect of glazes and glaze aesthetic, and by extension ceramic aesthetic as a whole. So an example from medieval time in Europe, and on the right an example by Ron Nagel, where he has faked the drip by carving it into the clay form itself, and then strategically glazing it with other colors to make you very aware of the quality of that edge created by this fake drip. We will talk about Ronagel a bit later on. This is just a first example of his work here. So you can see that application is quite important when you use the drip in ceramics. The gesture you make as you apply the glaze, and how much you let the glaze drip and run over the form, and in what directions, and so on and so forth. Those things have been used in very strategically and with great efficiency by many potters, notably in Japan. And in Japan as well, we have gray shino, which is another type of glaze with a very specific characteristic. Oribe ware, made for the tea ceremony, also engage with the fluidity and the runniness of glaze in quite stunning ways. And you can see here from those two examples from contemporary Japan how the aesthetic of Oribe and the aesthetic of Celadon and the use of the drip with very clear references to those historical precedents can still generate work of great sensibility and also great relevancy now. And I really like this plate of Wealden ware from England, 18th century. This is sponge ware, where the plate was glazed with a monochrome clear glaze, and then pigments were added on with a sponge to modify and mottle the surface. And I think this is of great effect as well. And a contemporary example of that kind of approach is of mixing different colors together and applying them in a very specific way to achieve the blurring of colors, which works so well in ceramics. Another way to blur color is what Clarice Cliff did on this bizarre ware from the 1920s, where using an already fired plate, she applied overglaze enamel diluted in a lot of oil and applied them in bands over the plate, and then took the plate and shook it in order for the oily material to move and drip and mix up over the form that was then fired to fuse this very wonderful effect into permanency. So I have many contemporary examples of people using glaze in wonderful ways. You have here the work of Janet Leach and Bernard Leach, because Bernard Leach, as he was introduced a bit in the last presentation, was one of the most important folk potter of the 20th century, and his influence was immense all over the world. And this is Bernard Leach making a plate by putting a stencil over the black glaze and then pouring the brown glaze on top to create this mountain motif. So it's at the same time very spontaneous, very intuitive, very improvised, and very controlled and deliberate. So wood ash glazes, another example by Bernard Leach on the right, and an historical example from Seto, Japan. The quality of wood ash glazes is very specific. It creates those runny all over surfaces that are quite a signature effect of that type of glaze. So glaze behave in all kinds of ways depending on their application, on their thickness, on the form in which they sit, on the temperature at which they are fired, and so on. And you can see on this example on the right, also by Bernard Leach, how the glaze can thin at edges and ridges to animate a form. So glaze can be poured, they can be splashed. There's all kinds of ways of applying them, and each time a specific effect is achieved, as we see in those wonderful work by Warren Mackenzie, a student of Bernard Leach in the 1950s. And here an example by Soji Amada, a Japanese contemporary of Bernard Leach, who again using a ladle poured the glaze, the black glaze, in a somewhat geometric pattern over another white glaze. And the process being a bit messy created this somewhat loose effect. So I have a series here of extreme drips, because if a characteristic of contemporary ceramics, it's its use of extreme process, of doing things with great excess and achieve extreme results in the process. And Yoshikawa Masamichi from Japan, in what I call the pearl necklace uses what would be a defect or possibly a problem with the glaze to create again an aesthetic result of great and quite wonderful beauty. While Christine Morris uses the glaze as the bead, where it just drips and collects strategically and again moves over the forms to create a very tactile effect, something that you really want to handle and touch and feel in your hands. While Klein Reed, a collective of designers, they have made the form with a ridge within the shape itself, so that the glaze will stop and collect and drip very strategically at that place. And this very controlled use of the drip by creating a form that will respond to the movement of the glaze in a very controlled way is quite interesting. And there have been quite a few makers who have used that strategy to create work of great originality, like Thomas Boll from Germany. And it's quite interesting to see how the drip invites you to touch, like it has a very sensual, almost erotic feel, with the form being changed by the drip in ways that invites handling and touching and feeling in a very sort of haptic and tactile manner. Glazes can be sprayed as well, and when they are sprayed in a certain way with a certain type of glaze, you can achieve all kinds of very interesting surfaces, like we see here in this work by Tenzin van Essen, or those pipes by Ben Medansky, where the glaze again creates droplets and bulbous shapes that again add tremendously to the tactility of the wear. This work by Christina Christensen is one of the most extreme being made in the recent past, and I call it the structural drip because the glaze becomes part of the structure of the form. It continues the form and expands it in some ways, as we see as well in Kozi Shiwara's discs on the right. So those kinds of approaches to using glaze not only to cover a form but to create a new form by making an object with openings where the glaze can ooze through and collect and create shapes on its own is quite a new development in ceramics, and it shows great potentials for future discoveries as well. As we see in this wonderful piece by Peter Johnson, where this structure, this architectural structure, was filled with a flux material that would melt in the kiln. And obviously the object was fired upside down, the other way around, over supports. And when the material inside melted and fluxed, it dripped out into those pointy things that again contest and challenge the architectural, geometric nature of the form itself. We will see much more example of that kind of approach to extreme when we look into the material aesthetics further on in lecture number 7. But I wanted to introduce it here within the lecture of the flux aesthetics because it's quite interesting how some people use glazes in such an extreme way that again the glaze becomes form. It becomes part of the form much more than the surface as we are used to. And Tokuro Kuwata is one of the great masters of this approach to extreme glazing to create work not only of great beauty but of great sensual feel and tactility that you need almost to close your eyes and touch with your hands and experience with your touch and more than with your vision. While somebody like Lenka Zereova has embedded the drip into the form by carving it again into the model from which he has made a mold and from which he can then make multiples. And this contests the nature of the drip, which is impossible to repeat exactly the same way. And here, by making it as part of the object, multiples can be made of a phenomenon that is basically immensely entropic otherwise. While John Roloff, doing what I call the dry spray, he uses a very unfluxed glaze that would remain very dry even after firing, and instead of spraying it at the wear, he sprays it in the air above it. and it falls into droplets like rain or snow over his large sculptural bolts. And then that rain snow effect is barely fused in the kiln so that it retains its original quality. And this is a very original use of a glaze, of a process, of a tool to create an effect that had never existed before. So glazes can be sprayed in all kinds of interesting ways. This is an example of the soft spray with a very diffuse effect. And you have wonderful example from Kuznetsov, a manufacturer in Russia at the beginning of the 20th century. Very, very early example of what we call abstraction in art, which we will look into further on next week in the decorative aesthetic lecture. And those works by Kenichi Shigeno using, again, stencils and strategic spraying to create pictorial effects. And now some more work by Ron Nagel, where you see how he has used the glaze and the drip, sometimes the natural drip that happens through process and to the fluxity and fluidity of the glaze itself in the kiln. As we see here on the left, the runny natural drip, and on the right with a carved drip, where that drip has been carved into the body of the form so that it is controlled, it is deliberate, it is a fake drip, if you wish, and it is then very strategically colored to make you aware of its inherent quality and its potency. And in quite recent work, Ron Nagel has pushed that fakiness of the reverse carved drip even further by carving the drip and presenting it in a non-logical fashion, anti-gravity. Instead of falling down, it moves up and engages with space and movement and our experience and expectation of the behavior of material and forms that is full of, again, possibilities for further development by him or by others. Liu Jianhua from China with the sculptural 3D drips, where he has carved forms that are like drips and positioned them all over the wall of this installation work. And the next image shows the work that is on the floor here within that installation. Those wonderful pottery forms that look as if they are already filled with the material, which could be blood or wine or some red substance of some form. But it is a fake bottom, basically. He has created the form so that just a thin layer of glaze within the form gives you the impression of a full containment. And again, that's a very clever and quite new solutions to using glazes in new ways. And more we see on the internet examples of virtual morphing, where forms have been distorted and manipulated in all kinds of exciting ways at the level of form or at the level of surface. And sometimes one isn't sure whether those objects are virtual objects or real objects. And some people do more of that stuff. Like I know, for example, that Johnson Sang's forms are actual ceramic forms that he makes and builds to look like such extreme modification of the fluidity of materials. Well, I'm not quite sure whether Roberta Hallen is working with ceramics or working just with virtual images and giving us the illusion of something, which is what I'm guessing it is, because some of the drops are even floating in space, which would be a complete impossibility in the actual world. So just to give you again an example of how glazed, and then what I call the arrested drip, where a drip has been applied in a way that it stopped its movement at some point, and then that was fixed further on in the firing in the kiln. The work of Ken Price, using here the painterly drips, where the drip make references to painterly surfaces and painterly references found in other art practices. And it's interesting to consider how very often glazes are used all over a form and covering the whole form. While when glazes are applied in very specific ways and very strategically so that only certain areas of the wear are covered with it, and then the glaze behaves over the form, and not only covers it completely, is an interesting strategy. And you can see here in the work at Tetsuya Yamada how by applying bands of glaze and then bands of unglazed surfaces, and how the glaze has interfaced and modified itself as it met the dry unglazed surface and moved over it. So it's interesting to consider all of those aspects of glazes, and what I call here the psychological drip, which is a form of the pour, where the glaze is poured over a form, but here to create an effect of abjection or unease that I call psychological in the work of Thomas Kutte. Because the drip can also easily become abject. It can reference bodily functions, bodily fluids, and it can create effects and experiences of unease and abjection, as I've mentioned earlier, that can be quite interesting to explore. And Sam Scott, you applying the glaze very strategically, as we can see him here, with what I call the considered drip, where the drip is applied in a very deliberate way over the form, and then when it is fired, you achieve this effect. And keep in mind what I said last week about the figure-ground relationship when you have black on light or light on black in the classical aesthetic surface. This effect is also at work in this work of Sam Scott. And those two pouring vessels by Alison Britton, one showing the double pour, where two contrasting color of blue have been applied by pouring glazes over the form, and on the right, what I call the reversed pour, where the pouring was done while the object was being held upside down, so that contests again gravity and our expectation of the behavior of liquids. And it's interesting to consider that those objects also have spouts and could be pouring vessels themselves, and could have even been engaged in the making of their own surfaces in that process. So there is a section now on special glazes, again to expand your knowledge and understanding of glazes. Luster glazes by Beatrice Wood, two wonderful examples here. Two very different luster glazes by Hideaki Miyamura from Japan. Crystalline glazes or crystal glazes by two of the great maker of that type of glazes. So if you're curious about crystalline glazes, you may want to research it further and find out how they're made and what process goes through in the making of those very wonderful glazes. And this is the work of Rose Kaba, who you see throwing on the wheel on the right, and one of her very miniature microcrystalline glazed forms that she made in the 1960s and so on. Other wonderful makers whose name you should know in relation with glazes are Maya Grotel or Gertrude and Otto Natzler, who worked as a pair. Gertrude and Otto Natzler. Gertrude would make the forms, Otto would make the glaze, apply them, and fire the ware. And in the 50s and 60s and 70s, they developed wonderful wares of great excess and originality and personality as well. And those are some examples of that type of work. You should be aware of the work of George Hoare, working at the end and the very beginning of the 20th century, who also developed a very excessive approach to glazing, using defects and issues and problems that may have created rejects in another context, but here create work of great aesthetic potency. Glenn Lukens, working in Los Angeles in the 1930s and 40s, also developed wonderful glaze effects. Vivica and Otto Aino, working in stoneware in the 60s and 70s and 80s, also were very tremendously influential. Again, Otto would throw the form, Vivica, his wife, would develop the glaze and glaze the ware, and their collaboration was very fruitful. In Australia, the great master of glazes is Greg Daly. This is Greg with the grouping of his work, so you can see that the forms are quite simple and familiar and it is the glaze and the way the work is glazed and the richness of the glaze that gives the work its power. Robert Silverman, working with porcelain tiles and applying the glaze in very specific and controlled way, and then firing it standing up in the kiln so that the glaze moves and becomes fluid and changes and you know enters into a relationship with the surrounding glaze and creating effects that could only have been achieved with those materials using those processes and letting the process itself create the final result. And all of those are specific to what I call ceramic aesthetics around fluxing. More recent young makers are using glaze in all kinds of ways. Those are two examples here where you have a very intimate relationship between the form and the surface, the object and the image, and so on. And all of those things are, again, quite specific to ceramics in its use of material and process and so on. Brian Rochefort is one of the great exponents of that approach to making. Chun Liao, using just one glaze colored differently over a grouping of forms, gives you, again, a wonderful experience. While Emmanuel Booth, instead of making thousands of glaze tests that become irrelevant objects after, he makes specific shapes of great simplicity that he uses in huge multiples to make his glaze test, and then that objects can be used to become part of an art installation or a display strategy, so that instead of becoming dejected and thrown out, they become part of his art making. And we're very close to the end here. The work of Yuting Jian from Taiwan with what I call the love handle on those bowls, which reference again Tang Dynasty stoneware glazes and teaware for the tea ceremony, but using color that are recently developed in the field of ceramic technology. And Tokuda Yasukishi from Japan with a technique that I call the pool. Well, the glaze collects at the bottom of a dish and creates this wonderful watery effect. And this is an artist using overglaze enamel applied in a certain way and fired in a certain way to create those amazing effects. Now I have an example here of the deliberate drip, and it is actually here used as a decal. It is a print that's been applied on these objects to give you the impression of a drip that would have been deliberately applied at the edge of the objects, which is always the worst possible use of the drip. And again, this idea of splattering glaze coming out of a brush all over a form indiscriminately, it's never a good idea. And I will complete with a few examples of the smudge by Jun Kaneko, where the plate has been fired standing up in the kiln so that the glaze will move and carry the pigment from the black into the white and create this wonderful effect of almost a 3D spatial experience, as we see on the left here. And now the object is positioned in the other direction from which it was fired to again make it float and give you the impression of an anti-gravity effect. While Stephen Young Lee on the right uses the smudge to soften up and diffuse the graphic nature of his landscape drawing. Jun Kaneko, again, the great master of the contemporary drip, with what I call velocity drips, as if wind or movement was affecting the fluidity of the material and its movement in space. And the very last image for today, again, for example, by Jun Kaneko, using both the accidental drip, which happens beyond the control of the maker, and the continuous drip, while Jun Kaneko, using a rubber syringe filled with glaze or with pigment, applies the glaze at the top of the ware, and by squeezing the rubber syringe, the material keeps running and running and running and running and running and creates those very, very, very long Those objects are about 2 meters tall. Those very, very, very long drips that could not be made in a natural way. But this is a very sophisticated use of a tool, of a material by a great master, and I hope it will be influential and an exciting example of what is possible with glaze and with the drip in ceramics.